Hi everyone, welcome back to Extra Credit, and this is our 10th episode on ancient Greece. So last time we left the Athenians basking in what seemed to be the miraculous victory against the Persians at the legendary field of Marathon, which meant that for the second time in a row now, the great King Darius found himself burning to make the Greeks pay for their crimes. But this time, nothing would be left to chance. Darius would muster an army so vast it would make his first invasion force seem like a warm-up act. But after 3 years of meticulous preparations, just as Darius was about to unleash the apocalypse, something happened that threw a little wrench into his plans. He died. Yeah, that was kind of a downer. But even with Darius himself dead and gone, the Greeks were by no means off the hook. That's because when it came to Greece, Darius's son, the new great King Xerxes, quickly became determined to finish what his father had started. Shortly after taking the Persian throne, Xerxes got right down to business, calling a meeting of the greatest noblemen from his realm to tell them in no uncertain terms what his plan was. According to Herodotus, once they had all gathered, Xerxes lost no time getting straight to the point. I am going to bridge the Hellespont, and then march an army through Europe and into Greece. My reason for doing this is to punish the Athenians for their actions against the Persians and my father. I shall not rest until I have captured Athens and put it to the torch. Once we have subdued the Greeks, there will not be a city or a nation left anywhere on earth capable of meeting us in battle. Okay, that part wasn't in Herodotus, but you get the idea. As you can imagine, the king's advisors were positively tripping over themselves to pat him on the back and tell him how amazing this idea was. His cousin Mardonius was particularly enthused, assuring Xerxes that the combination of his invincibility and the Greeks' pathetic weakness meant that nothing could possibly go wrong. But in the face of all this kissing up, it was Xerxes' older and wiser uncle Artabanus who brought everybody back down to earth with a great big splash of cold water. Reminding the council of the humiliation the Persians had suffered at Marathon just a few years ago, Artabanus warned, "You, O king, are about to go to war with men whose reputation by both land and sea is without parallel. Terrible danger lurks there. Rush into anything too fast, and you will trip up, most likely with appalling consequences." Now, this Debbie Downer speech did make Xerxes kind of grumpy, but he was at least wise enough to hear the wisdom in it and reluctantly pressed pause for the moment on his plans to invade Greece. But as he retired to bed that night to sleep on it, the gods apparently had other ideas. In one of his more fanciful tales, Herodotus tells us that Xerxes was visited that night in a dream by a menacing figure who commanded him to gather his army at once and set out for Greece. Not being one to risk angering the gods, Xerxes made up his mind once and for all and gave the order to summon the troops. But with his father Darius having learned the hard way about underestimating the Greeks, Xerxes wasn't about to make the same mistake. Sending out messengers to the four corners of his vast empire, Xerxes bled Persia dry to create an army of unimaginable magnitude. For 4 years, soldiers and sailors, builders and boats, farm animals and food came together to create the most awesome military force in recorded history. If Marathon was Helm's Deep, this would be the Pelennor Fields. That just means it was like a lot bigger. In Herodotus' simple words, indeed, for sheer scale, no other army of which we know has ever remotely compared to it. Now, the exact size of Xerxes' grand army has been endlessly debated. Herodotus puts the number somewhat generously at around 3 to 5 million, whereas most modern historians feel more comfortable between 200 to 500,000, which in any case is still well over 10 times the number of guys that landed at Marathon. On top of that, this time the Persians also brought with them a fleet of 1,200 state-of-the-art warships for dealing death and destruction by sea as well as land. Altogether, Xerxes' army came from a total total of 46 different nations within the Persian Empire, and when it came to signing up, the great king didn't take no for an answer. One man named Pythias learned this the hard way when he requested that his oldest son be allowed to stay back from the war so he could look after his dear old dad. In response, Xerxes said sure he can stay back. He then had the boy cut in half and was like, anyone else want to stay back? So in 481 BC, with all the preparations in place, Xerxes' grand army finally set out on its mission of revenge. But transporting so many men, machines, and materials across the globe from Persia to Greece would mean moving heaven and earth itself. Bridges were built, supply stations were set up, and canals for ships were dug, including this one here in northern Greece that modern archaeologists have measured at 2,000 meters long and 30 meters wide. Herodotus even claims that as the invasion force made its way across Western Asia, the thousands upon thousands of thirsty men and animals literally drank entire rivers dry. And before you roll your eyes at that, historians have done the math, and that actually checks out. I know, crazy, right? Historians doing math. But as monumental as all this was, none of it compared with Xerxes' most gargantuan ambition of all: bridging the Hellespont. The Hellespont is this strip of water which in ancient times marked the boundary between the two worlds of Europe and Asia. And even though Xerxes could easily have ferried his men across on boats, he wanted to seize the opportunity to make an unforgettable statement about the limitless power of Persia. To prove that he was lord of both land and sea, Xerxes commanded his builders to create one of the marvels of ancient engineering: two massive floating bridges that spanned 1,500 meters shore to shore. Now, the description of these bridges comes to us from Herodotus as usual, and historians don't buy all of his details, but if even a fraction of what he says is true, and it probably is, it's intense. Herodotus says that the skeleton of each bridge was a row of over 300 warships, each held together by enormous ropes, each weighing a couple of dozen tons. On top of this, thousands of planks were nailed down, with branches and dirt on top of those to form the walkway, with each colossal contraption then tied to the sea floor with anchors. But Xerxes' epic bridges weren't an overnight success. In fact, Herodotus says that the first pair was smashed to pieces in a sudden storm. Furious that Mother Nature would dare challenge him, Xerxes took actions that were both drastic and ridiculous. On the drastic side, Xerxes had the construction managers beheaded, and on the ridiculous side, he sent men into the waves armed with whips to literally beat the sea into submission. And as they lashed out 300 times, they cried, "O bitter water, this is done to you by your master as punishment for the wrong you did him. Xerxes will cross you, whether you wish it or not." Because nothing says I'm secure in my masculinity like beating up water. But finally, after 4 years of monumental preparations and a second and more successful try with the bridges, Xerxes' grand army was at last ready for its crusade of carnage. But just as he was about to give the green light from where he sat on his seaside throne overlooking his troops, the great king began to weep. His uncle Artabanus, who as you remember hadn't been a big fan of this whole idea from the start, asked him what was wrong, and in a sudden burst of emotion, Xerxes exclaimed, "I was moved to compassion when I considered the shortness of all human life, since of all this multitude of men, in 100 years' time, not one of them will be alive." With that, the great king pulled himself together, said one final prayer to his gods, and gave the order to march, watching as his men tramped across the Hellespont and into history. Herodotus tells us that the crossing took 7 days and 7 nights, and when the last of Xerxes' men had set foot in Europe, the distant boom of Persian footsteps could soon be felt. Which meant Hey everyone, thanks again for watching Extra Credit. Hopefully you're enjoying the series so far and have been following along with us as it unfolds. Your pop quiz for this week is how many warships were in Xerxes' invasion force? Make sure to drop off your answer in room 215 as always. As always, work hard, read books, play outside, and we'll see you next time.